So I don't know, probably we can start, I think.
All right.
So I don't know, probably I can start basically because this is my lecture. So hi, hello for everyone. So today we have some guest lectures. We have Aušra from Women4Cyber Lithuania. And today probably she will talk about what we have on the screen, so security policies and frameworks for our lecture. So I don't know, maybe Aušra, you can introduce yourself and talk about what you have to do for today for us.
Yes, sure. So hi everyone, my name is Aušra Dilionaitė. And yeah, today we're going to talk about the security policy and frameworks, and mostly about the frameworks related to how to build and develop and maintain security policies, so not in general around all of the existing security frameworks. But before we jump into the actual lecture, a few words about myself. So I'm working currently as an information security officer, and I'm also a Women4Cyber Lithuania member. Before I started as an information security officer, I was working as a consultant and manager and auditor, and in cybersecurity implementation reviews and many other types of projects over the last almost 15 years, I guess. And today we're not only going to cover the policies, but also talk a little bit about the certification process, because I also have background in performing certification audits, internal and external ISMS audits. And I'm representing Women4Cyber Lithuania organization. So this is a nonprofit European private foundation, which is our mother company, you could call it that way. And then our local chapter is one of the 11 currently established chapters, and we want to support the objectives on the national level. So basically having more and more women joining the field of the cybersecurity, encouraging the diversity. And to learn more about us, you can visit one of the two pages listed. And if you want to join, we're welcoming many members, and very happy for everyone who wants to learn about information security or join, share their knowledge, collaborate, and increase the diversity in all the way. So today's agenda is basically, I'm going to start a little bit with the introduction into the ISO and what is management systems, and look into the 27,000 family, just to make sure that we all are on the same page when I'll be using certain terms throughout of the discussion. And if you have any questions, you can raise them during the presentation or wait until the very end, where there will be some time for the questions. If you want to ask them during the presentations, I don't see you. So you have to shout or raise your hand and shout and somehow show me that you want to ask the question. Probably shouting works the best. So once we look a little bit on the terminology, the next part will be the main focus of today, which is the security policy. So we're going to discuss some of the ISO requirements. We're going to look at what are the different types of policies that can be made in the organizations, and how they can be organized in different hierarchies, and also discuss the policy models, and just chat a little bit about the new trends that are coming and we need to consider when we're developing now policies in our organizations. And as I mentioned, the last part will be the certification process. So how does that certification process looks like? So if we start with the ISO, ISO is International Organization for Standardization. Maybe you already all know this, so just a very quick intro here. It's an independent, non-governmental organization, and the members are national standards bodies. So they're not a private organization, and not just any private organization or non-private organization can join the ISO. It has to be approved national standard body, and there's one body per country. So Lithuania has Lithuanian Standard Board. And why it is important for us to know? So basically, when the ISO release different types of deliverables, And these deliverables can be standards, technical specification, reports, guides, and so on. Then national bodies, they can release a national version of that standard. So it can be a little bit different from the international standard. So when we're referring to ISO, for example, 27001 or 2, we're talking about the international standard normally, but the national bodies can have a little bit different versions that are applicable for that particular country. Normally, the differences are not that many. Usually it's only a translation to the local language, but it's important sometimes to know when you're dealing with international organizations that there can be slight differences in the standards. So to get to a standard level on that deliverable, there's a really long and complicated process that involves many of the different structures where the standard has to travel through. So I'm not going to discuss all of the structures and so on. If you're really interested, you can look at the ISO page, and they have the full description of what each of these committees or council do and how they contribute to that process. But for today's discussion, for our discussion today, it's really important to know that to get to a standard, there's a long way and requires a lot of agreement. There can be some differences on the local translations of the standards. And then we will be focusing on ISO standards specifically, and specifically on 27,000 family. So another thing to know and agree on, because we're going to be using this term a lot for our discussion, is the management system. So there is an official definition of the management system by the ISO, which is the way in which an organization manages the interrelated parts of its business in order to achieve its objectives. But if we look just really plainly and simply, then we have people, we have policy, we have organizational structures, we have procedures, we have processes, we have technology. And all of these different elements, they are organized and managed in certain way to achieve some sort of objective. So then what are those different objectives that can be? So if we're looking at the information security, that would be to have a managed information security, and that would be the information security management system. And we would be talking about this management system standard, yet another term that the ISO uses. So the standard for it is just a set of requirements or guidance to help organizations manage their policies and processes to a specific objective, which in our case would be information security. And there are over 80 management system standards. Today, we're only going to be looking at one example of those, which is focused on the information security management. But you might have heard about the others, which is 9,000 family for quality management, 14,000 for environmental controls and safety, and there are many, many more. And then in ISO, again, definitions, it's really important to know the difference between type A and type B management system standards. So type A management system standard contains requirements against which an organization can claim conformance, and type B does not. So if we look at the very specific example, again, we're going to discuss this in more detail today. We have a type A normative, ISO 27001 standard, which is security requirements. And then we have type B, which is informative, which is information security good practice. So it's good practice, guidance and controls, and not really a requirements. And this year, we already have the new version for the 27002, and the new version for the 27001 is going to be coming as well. So that was a lot of introduction on the terms. Are there any questions so far, or can we now jump into a more fun part? I'm gonna wait for like 5 seconds before jumping.
Probably we can jump in.
All right. If you have any questions, as I said, just shout out. So the most important and the most interesting family for us when we talk about the information security, but also generally about cybersecurity, there are now more standards coming for the cybersecurity specifically. Then this is known as ISO 27000 family. So we're gonna look a little bit and meet and greet the family. There are, can't remember the exact number, but definitely more than 20, 30, maybe 30 something already released standards, and more of them coming. So there are a lot of standards in the family, but we only focus on a few of them to illustrate how they relate to each other. And we have the vocabulary, 27,000. So this sets all the terms and definitions that are used consistently throughout the rest of the standards. And then we have the requirements. So we have the 27,001, which we'll be mostly talking about today. And then we have 27,006 and 27,701. So that works for privacy, basically. And then we have general guides. So I think you have already looked and discussed some parts of the 27,002 in the previous lectures. So that's a guide or good practice, how we implementing different security controls. But then we also have the 3, which is ISMS implementation. So it provides guidance like how do you actually implement ISMS? How can you do it? What different activities can you perform? Then we have 27,004, which talks about the different KPIs, measurements, how you can evaluate your security controls, what kind of metrics can you look at, and so on. Then my favorite is information security risk management, 27,005. And then we have 7 and 8, which talk about ISMS auditing. So they introduced what kind of different audit techniques can you have, what would be a requirement for you to perform the audit, how can you test, how you can decide what kind of testing you should do, how do you decide how much and what and so on, all of the controls should test. So that includes testing the governance, but also includes how to test the technical controls as well. And then we have some of the industry guides as well. And oftentimes is the question that I'm receiving, like, if we're the telecommunication organization, is it enough for us to look only at the industry guide? So my answer is not really, because the industry guides, they oftentimes have very specific examples, how you can implement the control in relevant for that industry, but they also refer a lot to the 27,001 standard or 27,002 as well. So just by looking at that industry guide, you will not necessarily have the full picture of how to actually implement the information security management system. And now let's look at what is known as a rockstar of the family. And that's the most famous standard of the family because everyone gets certified against this particular standard. So it contains the requirements for information security management system, which is basically just a framework of policies and controls on how to manage and organize your security, how to assess risk systematically. And because it's requirements type A standard, you can get certified against it. It's one of the 3 normative standards in the family. And this is the only standard that you can actually get certified against. You need to have implemented clauses 4 to 10, which is context of the organization, leadership, planning, support, operations, performance evaluation, and improvement to be able to pass the certification. And then you need to select the controls from the Annex A and implement those based on your risk assessment process. So we're gonna talk about the certification in the end, so I'm not gonna talk anymore at this point. But any questions so far? All right, then we proceed next and look exactly at the security policy. So again, going back to the 27,001, so that's the requirements for the security policies that are coming from the standard. And why we're looking into the standard. So if you want to have a certified system, information security management system at the end, you have to comply with that. But if you're not aiming for the certification, then you can do whatever you want in your policy, basically. But let's start with if you actually want to have a certified information security management system. So Requirements for security policy, they are in clause 5, which is in the leadership clause. And the main requirements that you have to satisfy and pass, so having the top management establishing that information security policy, and that security policy needs to be available for all the stakeholders. It has to be communicated to all interested parties. And then it also has to be aligned with the purpose of the organization. It has to include the security objectives, and it has to explicitly state the commitment to fulfill the information security requirements and also commitment for continual improvement. If any one of these parts are missing, you're not satisfying the requirements. So each and every component of this requirement has to be in place and explicitly mentioned in the security policy if you want to have the certified ISMS. And then we also have Annex A from those controls, which also have 2 controls related to information security policies. And normally they're not really mandatory, but since the security policy is mentioned in the clause 5, they kind of become mandatory if you want to have the certified information security management system. So this deals with the management direction for information security, and so the policy has to contain that management direction for information security, and it can be a set of policies. It can also be one big policy. There's no particular requirement whether it should be 1 or 2 or many or 20, but it has to be a set of policies in 1 or several documents, and it has to be defined, approved by management, published, communicated to all employees and relevant parties, and then it has to be reviewed on the regular basis. And if any significant changes occur, and those significant changes can be your organization grew up a lot, you had merger or acquisition, your technology stack changed considerably, or anything else that basically influence also political changes, organizational changes, anything in your context that influence how that policy was defined. Yes, and then you have to make sure that it is suitable, adequate, effective, working as expected. And if you define the policy and policy lives its own life and employees live another life, so maybe you need to redefine it eventually when the audit comes and says, well, your policy doesn't really match the reality. So that's the formal requirements for the policy. In reality, in the organizations, there are very many different ways of how the security policies are organized. And I've seen as a consultant in a different organization, all sorts of flavors. So I've seen really huge, big ISMS or information security policies that contains every aspect you can think of. And I also seen really huge hierarchies of the policies, which the highest level policies are really short, just 1 page or so, and then follow another level of policies, then follow another level of policies and some procedures and guidance and so on, and everything in between. But if we look at the standard guidance, so basically the standard suggests that it might be a good practice to have sort of 3 levels of policies. So high-level general policies, and these are overall guidelines, not the guidelines, should not be using guidelines, but directions for the management and that set of activities. And this can be code of conduct, very high-level procurement policy, or in the security perspective, the security policy. Then we have the high-level specific policies, and these usually are for a particular topic. And or the function of the organization as well, it can be. And in our case, it would be information security policy. And then you can have a topic specific policies. So they can be some internal requirements or some very specific area or a target audience. And if we're looking at the set of controls in the Annex A, or we're looking at those clauses, so each of the different clauses can have its own policy, or the set of controls in Annex A can have their own policy. So examples would be access control, incident management, business continuity, and risk management, and a number of other policies. But in reality, this might not necessarily be policies in the organization. If you don't have the culture for having a lot of different policies, so you might only have the information security policy, and then under it you can have, for example, access management standard or incident response procedure or any other way organizing these. So they not necessarily can be policies. The top specific policies are very, very depending on the organization and organizational context. If you want to be ISO certified, the only thing that you really need to have in place is information security policy, named as a policy, documented as a policy, and satisfying all the policy requirements. All right, so the policy is intentions, direction of the organization, formally expressed by its top management. And as I said, information security policy needs to be a policy. And then there is sometimes a mix between the policy and guideline. Guideline is a document stating general rule, principle, information, how something should be done. So for information security policy, this should not be mixed. Information security policy is the only one that has really specific requirements, how it needs to be set up. And as I said, the rest can be policies, procedures, guidelines, standards, security manuals. And so policies are more intentions, direction of the organization. Procedures are more step-by-step descriptions on how to do a certain action. Guidelines are more of a general rules or examples how to get things done. And then the standards, they are more like requirements. So there are a number of different documentation that you can have in the organization. And again, it will depend on what organization has in place. And looking at the policy models, or also known as like how do you define the content of the policy or structure. There usually is administrative, policy summary, introduction, scope, objective. It can have principles, it can have responsibilities, can also have key outcomes, mention of other related policies, and also need to have policy requirements or policy statements as such. So when you're defining policies, at the very least, at the very minimum, you should be thinking about the administrative parts, which in essence is like a policy title, a version, some sort of a metadata publication, who is approver, was it approved, and things like that. Then the policy summary is a high-level statement of what the policy is about. So 1-2 statements, not more. Policy statement and introduction can be merged together, so they don't have to be separate parts. But if your normal policies have these separate parts, and you all obviously would have the same for the information security policy. And then the scope. So the scope describes what are the activities or what are the parts that the policy deals with or is affected by the policy. And then what are the other, to which policies it also relates, can also be mentioned here in the scope. And objectives for the information security, that would be what are the security objectives that the policy is dealing with. Principles are not mandatory, so you can have some security principles listed here. The responsibilities are a requirement in another standard clause, but in most of the organization, these requirements are just mentioned in information security policy. So responsibilities are not really mandatory, but they kind of are a part of the information security policy in most general cases. And key outcomes, what exactly is coming out of this policy that describes usually the business outcomes, and what will happen if the objectives are met or not met. And again, in this case, it can also be merged with the objectives of the policy. And that's pretty much it. So any questions until now? Either you all asleep or everything is very clear.
Not at all. In a previous slide, I saw diagrams. Is there some notations? How diagrams are drawn?
So there, if we're talking formally, there aren't really requirements for how to draw the diagrams, and it will at the end depend on what type of diagram it is. So obviously for network diagrams, if it's going to be a part of your documentation package, you will use the network notations, can use anything that is in or business process, so can use business process notation markup or whatever that was called. So basically wherever you're using for any other type of diagrams, the standard doesn't really prescribe that it needs to follow this or another notation. If you use UML, you use UML. If you use BPMP, you use BPMN. So that's for business processes. It doesn't really matter. Wherever you're comfortable and wherever is used in your organization will work in this case. But I'm not sure if that was the question. If I haven't answered it,
Yes,
ask again.
yes, thank you. Yeah, answered, because sometimes diagrams are more informative than 100 sheets of text.
Yeah, I agree. It also works well when you're working with the developers. That's more easier to communicate than writing 100 of pages policies. So that's for sure. I especially love network diagrams. It makes all sense to me. So I like to look at those, and I like to draw those and include those in my policy packages instead of having specific policies for networks or communication descriptions. But that's just preference. All right, but thank you for the question. At least I know one person is not sleeping, so that's good. Again, the policy can have a development life cycle, just like software can have a development cycle, and any other documentation can have a life cycle. And for the policy, we have the 4 main elements, I guess we could call it that way. So all of the policies, and especially information security policy, it should be driven as a result from the risk assessment. So your risk assessment results should dictate what is going to be included in that particular policy, what is important for you, and so on. But there are other aspects that kind of should be included in the risk assessment, but not all risk assessment methods have this in the methods. So other important aspects to consider is organizational context, like are there any laws or regulations applicable for us, what type of organization we are, what are the security objectives that matter to us, and these will be different for different organizations. If you work with the critical infrastructure, you will have one set of the things that are important for you and things that need to be included in the policy. If you work for a healthcare organization, that will be completely different, that needs to be included in the policy. So all the policies should be driven by the risk assessment. If you ever get a question by ISO auditor, this is the answer you should be saying in any type of question you're getting, like, why you have this in place? It's because of the risk assessment. So just a tip here. And then we go to the policy establishment. And once we define, based on that previously looked like a policy model. So once we define the structures, once we define the hierarchies, then we kind of go and define our own policy, include our security objectives, make sure that it is documented and approved by the management. And then we go to implementing that policy. So we're making sure that everything that we described in the policy is actually now being rolled out and implemented, and we have all the things in place, from the people to processes to technology. And then we go into policy monitoring and maintenance. And all of this is supported obviously by management approval. You don't have a policy, especially information security policy, if it's not approved by the management. That's the ISO standard requirement. And then you don't really have the policy from the ISO perspective if employees don't know about it. So the employees should know about it, should be living according to that policy, and should be providing the feedback to improve that policy through your policy monitoring and maintenance processes. Okay, so to the tips. Now you newly coming to the organization, very enthusiastic, you know, your first week, and you're like, yes, I'm gonna define all the policies, I'm gonna implement ISMS, I'm gonna be awesome. And you know, so where do you start really? So the first thing is there anything that you can already leverage? So other internal control procedures or structures are things you need to follow. Do you have already policy structures that are predefined that you need to follow? Are there certain hierarchies in place that you need to follow? And also looking at what other policies already exist are established. So information security policy should not be coming to life as a completely separate thing. It needs to integrate with wherever else already exists into their organization. So for example, I mentioned previously the 9000, the quality management system. If your organization already implements the quality management system, it already has the defined policy structures and record and document management procedures probably in place and processes for it. So when you're defining your information security policy, you will have to align to that. And then the other tricky part is always to consider organizational context. So it's definitely going to be very different when you have a highly regulated industries. They usually have more requirements, so they have a more rigid structures for the documentation as well. And compared to just a newly established startup, which might not have any requirements at this point or any of the structures or documentation, so that's going to look quite differently. And then also for international companies, they need to have an unbalanced different cultures and attitude. So I worked for one organization that had offices in Germany and France and Norway and Netherlands, and all of these different cultures, they have very different attitude to how much documented information they want and in what way they want to have that documented information, and how they really live with those policies in a sense, and how they want to reach them, and how they. So there are a lot of cultural differences that international companies need to balance. In that case, I usually suggest you considering just choosing baseline policy and requirements. So the things that you must have in place, because, for example, you have some sort of legal requirements or based on your risk assessment, and then allow for a local extensions. So for example, in Germany, they like to have much more and everything written and documented. So they had a lot of local extensions to all those baseline policies, while in France, they didn't like so much to have written and documented procedures and policies. So they had this baseline policy. They said, this is enough for us. And for the rest, we kind of go on just agreeing verbally, and then it works much better for us. Then, as I mentioned, the organizational cultures and attitudes to the documentation have to be considered as well. I work for one organization that they hated to have written policies in place. They called it, they said they have allergies to the policies. So they had very few written policies in place, but they really liked the automated workflows. So we try to get and put as much of the things as possible into automated workflows instead of writing the policies. In that case, we only had the information security policy with a few procedures, and the rest were automated workflows. Yeah, other organizations have all of their policies, for example, in compliance. The development companies, they use to compliance. They want to have their policies in compliance as well, because that works for them. And yet others can have really layered hierarchical structures, and I work for some organizations like that as well. So you have really clearly defined structures. This is our high-level policy, and it only contains these aspects. Then we have another layer of policy, which is approved by other type of management level, and it has these different aspects. And then it goes all the way to the procedures, and again, all the way to the workflows eventually. And then you have to think, if you want to have a certified ISMS, so there are those requirements for the policies in the standard that you have to balance those requirements, and then all of these other aspects like the cultures, the attitudes, and so on. And those requirements, how do you know which ones to look at? So they will be all expressed as shall in the standard, and also look for the word which says documented. So specifically for the information security policy, the organization shall have that policy, and it shall be documented, and then it shall be approved by the management, and it shall show management commitment, and so on. So those shall to look for. Then the other part, now we've developed our policy. We're so happy we managed to write it down, you know, on all the good stuff. The question is, how do we communicate the policy? So there are many different ways. Again, you have to look at what works for that particular organization. You can use the intranet if that's the usual way to do it. You can schedule the meetings to talk about the policy. You can send the policy. You can send the link to the policy. You can, you know, spam on the Slack channel, or you can also define your onboarding process that includes communicating the information security policy in the onboarding or onboarding session or processes. And I've seen all sorts of things, but the standard requires that the policies need to be communicated. So then really the question for you is, how are you going to prove that the policy has been communicated? Are you going to maintain the records? Are you going to ask each of the employees to sign that they have read and understood the policy? In reality, signing that you have read and understood the policy is just a signature. Most of the employees don't actually read the policies. So having onboarding sessions where you actually go and explain some aspects in the policies are a much better option than just sending a link and asking to sign. But then again, will depend on how much resources and capacity you have to do it, and what are your requirements. And also an important consideration, who are the recipients of that policy? Well, of course, the employees will be the recipients of that policy if you're defining it for the organization. But you can also have the contractors who are working in one or the other arrangement for the organization. You can have vendors, suppliers, partners, some other third parties, organizations where you are the vendor or the supplier, and they asking for that policy as well. So all of these aspects need to be considered. How exactly are you going to communicate that policy to these different sets of the recipients? Any questions so far?
Yes. I'm wondering, you mentioned about policies automation. So that signing is automation already, or you have other examples, good practice examples?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one thing is whether you want to get certified. For the certification process, you'll have to show that all the employees in some way had received, read, and understood the policy. And one way of doing it is, for example, having an automated workflow where the employees can put the signature, yes, I read and understood. Or you can have a paper process where they sign the form and you put it in their file or whatever. You can have, for the document management system, there might be also some automated workflows that you could utilize as well. You can have team meetings where you go through the policy, and then everyone who participated in that meeting would be considered that they understood. And I guess I've seen the most often working part is really through onboarding sessions where somebody is doing introduction session saying like, these are the policies we have, and these are the most important aspects of the policy that we have in place. And then everyone sort of either automatically is considered understood and you keep the record that these were the participants in the session, or you additionally ask them to sign in either workflow or in some other type of way or form. There's also a tricky part with updates of the policy, because any updates of the policy have to be communicated to the employees again, and then you have to figure out what is the best way to do it. The efficient way is usually sending the email and having somewhere in your policies describing that any update sent in the email is a common way of communicating the things in the organization, and all employees have to read the emails that discuss these topics. So it does make it compliant, but in reality, can you really guarantee that the employees have read this? Probably not. So again, it's going to be a balance between whether you're trying to stay compliant with this requirement of communicating the policy, or if you actually are interested to find the best way in which the employees like to consume the information and send that information in that particular form or way. So I use both. I try to be compliant, obviously, when I'm maintaining the ISMS, which is certified, but I also try to find some more fun ways of doing communication of the policies. So we have some fun like a Christmas calendar type of things, where we include some parts from the policy as a questions in the Christmas calendar, and then the employees can participate in that game. And if they manage to answer everything correctly, they can be included in the drawing for the prize or something of that sort. So you can find also a more fun and engaging and more gamification type of thing of how to communicate that policy. And there's a whole bunch of things that go. Usually you can include the communication of your policy as part of your awareness training package or the campaigns as well. So there are a lot of fun stuff that I can talk here, but did that answer the question?
Yes, as I understood, it's more related to informing employees about policies, but if it's possible, somehow automate the policy in general. Instead, you're not trusting your employees, or you're a big company and you can't control or want to increase.
Yeah, got it.
And what automation could be implemented of policies?
Yeah, we're gonna touch a little bit on that in that new trends about the policies. So I'll just leave that question of yours till that part, if that's okay.
Okay.
Cool. All right, now we had our policy established, approved, communicated. We're happy living with it, and then we need to also make sure that we have control, review, and evaluation of that policy. So the control is ensuring the conformity. So basically making sure that wherever we list it in the policy is actually how it is in practice, that everyone is following that policy. And evaluation basically means measuring the degree of conformity. So let's say if we had to send everyone an email telling that, there has been policy changes, or we had employees to sign that there have been changes, and we see that only 70% of employees received the email or they signed for that policy, that would be one of your measurements, for example. But there are many other ways, and these audit standards that I mentioned, they describe a bunch of the different ways and KPIs on how you can measure whether or not you are conforming, and how you can evaluate if things are working correctly or not. And then you have to review your policies, so that means maintaining the conformity. So during the review process, you gather all the information, whether it's from internal audit or other type of reviews, management review process, or just your incidents or any other, and see if there were any violations on the policy. You can try to figure out if those violations were what was the root cause of it. And sometimes the root cause is because the policy is living its own life and employees are living their own lives. So then you probably need to either change the processes or update the policy so it stays conformant to the reality in a sense. And these control, review, and evaluate processes for information security policy, they have to be formal. They have to have the records because that's also part of the requirements. But in many of the other policies, you can have more leeway there. Again, the control, review, and evaluate, when I say formal, you have to have the record. It doesn't mean that the record has to be written by hand on the paper. It can be part of your document management system. It can be automated in some ways. So there are many ways to do it as well. Yeah, and new trends to consider. So everything is a code. And since everything is a code, infrastructure as a code, many things as a code, we now have also the policy as a code, risk, security, and compliance as a code, and just basically everything as a code in a sense. So policy as a code, I had a few examples. So one of the examples that I can mention for organization, they had most of their environment on Azure, for example. So we were also using Azure to document our policies, and also we're using Azure dashboards to make sure that we're compliant. So that was compliance as a code part as well. So policies written on the Azure, the metadata was enforced through or controlling, managing, or automating the policies was also enforced using version control, so GitHub in that particular case. And we use that for policy administration instead of maintaining the records in a traditional way, which is all fun and good and nice. If you only live your life as a smaller organization on certain environment. If you really big organization that policy is a code or security or compliance is a code or wherever, it's going to be just one tool in your tool set. And if you want to have a certified ISMS, and most likely you will still need to have a documented, more of a traditional way policy in place as well, at least for the information security policy. But I found the policy as a code actually quite convenient. So when we take some aspects, for example, for access management, also, for example, for vulnerability management, and we or also our GDPR requirements, when we set the requirements directly in the environment, in the cloud environment, that we can't have virtual machines running in certain regions, for example. So you can have a lot of these policies as a code really helping you out. So when you don't have to go and check manually how things are and if they are following your policies or not. And there's also some really great standards or benchmarks that you can use to get that compliance as a code part. So for example, Center for Internet Security, they have a number of benchmarks that many of the big cloud providers like GCP and AWS and Azure, they support. So you can run that benchmark and have displays in dashboard, which shows how many issues you have or don't have. And also the default build like Azure, GCP, and all the others like trust centers or security centers, you can use those to also establish the policy, but also to run and see the compliance. So these are new and fun trends, but if you want to have the certified ISMS, probably you will still need to maintain at least a very high level information security policy as a document somewhere. So does that answer at least to an extent your question, or do you have a follow-up question on this one?
Yes, it answered. So thank you for enlightening. Now I understand Azure policies I have read, but previously I did not have any understanding what it's used for.
Yeah, so these are really convenient. Also, I know AWS a little bit better, but on AWS, like for the compliance bit, we had some really rigid data retention requirements. So you can also establish those data retention requirements defining straight on AWS, and then they make sure that they transfer or not allowing access if you just use that specific setting. It was super convenient, not having to bother and write a lot of stuff by yourself. So these built-in compliance and policy functionalities are really great. But unfortunately, if you're using cloud native tools, like for that particular environment, it's not that easy transferable to another environment. So in that case, you can also consider using some other tools that are environment agnostic, could you call it that way? So like, you know, like for infrastructure as a code, you can use Terraform, and you can also include some of the policies in that infrastructure as a code and enable it through that, so then it can work on different cloud environments, for example. So that's on the new trends. Any other questions on the new trends or any other interesting observations that I would love to learn about? No, okay, so then just me teaching you today. But otherwise, I'm very interested to learn if I miss some new trend that it's really fun to look at. So if you know of something, let me know. All right. So we'll just go through a number of tips, sort of summarizing, but also what I learned from my many years of experience working with the organization. So for certified ISMS, you have to follow all the formal requirements that need to be met. And that includes having documented, published, communicated information security policy, which also has management commitment, management support, approved by management, and so on. And then this is a funny part, but I don't believe that I have actually to state this, but it's apparently not that really common knowledge that people in the organization, when they're reading the policy, they should be able to understand the policy without interpreters. And I'm writing this bullet point because in one organization, I was pretty much working as the interpreter, even though I was formally supposed to be the risk analyst and not really a security analyst. So they were coming to me and asking like, but what does the sentence in the policy mean? And when it's just one case, it's one thing, but when it's like during every risk assessment, you get the same questions over and over again, you realize, okay, the policies are not great, because if people reading can't understand what's written in the policy, they can't really follow the policies, right? So writing the policies, it's important to keep the end users in mind, like who will be reading the policy, who this policy is applicable for, and will they be able to understand what we're saying in that policy without us being there continuously explaining what it means. And it's the policy should be, you should be able to share the policy with all stakeholders, and that includes external parties. So be considerate if you're including any secret or sensitive information in the policy. And if you need to have some secret or sensitive information, your information security policy, that high-level document, then consider having two policies. One for the internal consumption, another one for the external. Because as I said, there are many parties that might need to get your information security policy, and a lot of those, again, suppliers, partners, some sort of request for information processes where you have to supply your information security policy and so on. So it's important to be able to send your information security policy externally, whether having one document or two separate ones. Many years ago when I just started, so that's over a decade or even more ago when I just started working on information security management system audits and implementation, there used to be a trend to have a separate information security policy or a security policy, and then another policy which was called information security management system policy. And usually that second one, ISMS policy, contained pretty much the repetition of the standard, saying this is exactly how we implement it in our organization. So luckily, I haven't been seeing many of those anymore. It's possible to have ISMS policy. It's possible to have security policy. You can have just one policy or many, but personally, I don't see the need to have the ISMS policy as a separate policy. Normally, all these aspects will be covered either through processes or procedures, so it doesn't really make sense to make in just one policy. So that's my personal impression. And as I said, I've not seen those ISMS policies so many lately, so I guess that's also more of a general understanding now. And should the policies for information security should follow the same structures as other policies in the organization. And at the very least, they should contain the purpose, the scope, the policy statement, and some administrative attributes like what is the version or approver or whatever else metadata you're keeping about the policies. And you have to ensure that it is controlled, evaluated, reviewed, as we just discussed. But to have a really working information security management system, that's what we're really aiming when we're defining the policy. The policy needs to be anchored in all levels of the organization. So normally my tips and tricks here is, do you have some early adopters who are really, happy about having some policies? And oftentimes it's compliance function I'm tipping you here. Or some champions who just crazy about the information security, or some allies that your best friends in the organization that can help you push the policies that you need to get in place and get buy-in from the rest of the stakeholders. And also it's important to involve those different stakeholders in the development process and also include their feedback. So in many cases, the employees or middle management or high management or whichever management layer looking at, they're not really happy if you just bring the end result and say, can you please sign this? They kind of like to be also consulted about how do you understand the information security, what is important for us as an organization. So if you're tasked with writing the policy, don't think that it's just your responsibility to write it up and get approval, but also make sure that you're including and involving other people that might give their feedback. And when they give their feedback and are involved in the process, it's also much easier for them to then follow the policy and also accept it and eventually approve it as well. All right. So any more questions around the policy before I skip to the certification process? If I now give you an exercise to write a security policy, will you know what to do? All right, taking out the papers and pens. Any questions now?
Yeah,
a lot
just
of
10 minutes and we can do everything.
By the way, the form or the pattern, how the document is written, also recommended in ISO, or you should figure out by yourself?
So the ISO standard, they give you a lot of freedom, and they don't really say exactly how the structure of your policy should look like. Also don't say on which form or material. You can write it on a napkin if you want to, as long as you're going to be able to reproduce it and show to the auditor, and every employee is able to get that napkin and read it. So it doesn't really matter how you write it up. The standard doesn't define it. But when you read through the different requirements in the standard, you can get the feeling that certain things should be mentioned in information security policy. And when I said those little bits, where did I say them? Here. Yeah, like purpose, scope, and policy statement, these sort of, these structural elements, you get the feeling that they need to be there. But the actual requirements for the policy says it should be documented, it should be published, it should be communicated, it should have management commitment. So normally you will have a statement saying that our management is really concerned about the information security, and is giving the resources to, reach the required level based on our risk assessment or something of that sort. And approval by the management kind of that policy kind of satisfies the approved by the management part. And also, you will definitely have somewhere in that policy the statement of your security objectives, because if you don't have it in the information security policy, you'll have to have a separate policy for the information security objectives. So it usually doesn't make sense. And then the other bit, which also not really a part of the structure, but most of the policies added a part of the structure, again, because of the requirements, is for the roles and responsibilities. So it is required to define the roles and responsibilities for information security. And in most cases, the easiest way to do it is to just include the basic information security roles and responsibilities in your policy document for the information security. So the standard doesn't have like very strict, these things should be in this policy, but it has really strict requirements. You have to have security objectives documented. You have to have roles and responsibilities documented. You have to have a documented information security policy. You have to have management commitment, management approval. So when you combine all of these elements, you kind of end up like, okay, it's the easiest to have all of this just included in information security policy.
Yeah, I understand. To read a lot before doing an example.
So if we look at the requirements, is 27,001, and then we have 27,002, which is guidance. So they kind of provide you a little bit more information. Okay, you can do it this way, you can do it this way. And then we have 27,003, which is guidance on ISMS. And that document gives you also a few examples. Okay, you could write this policy like this way, or your objectives could look like this way, or your document structure could have these elements in place. So they have, if you combine these three, you'll have some sort of examples on, okay, how do I organize my information security policy? But, Google has a lot of examples of how the information security policy should look like. So just Googling also helps. My tip.
As usual.
Maybe I shouldn't say it as an official tip, but my tip, nowadays there are really a lot of predefined security policies that you can just take and see what makes sense for your organization, and throw out the rest and start not from the scratch, but also from some sort of a guidance already.
Good to hear, because I already afraid if we need to start from the blank page. Oh.
Yeah, since I've been working as a consultant, I can also say a lot of consulting companies can have these offers where they bring document package. So it already has all the structures and some general what is included in most commonly as an objectives or organizational structures and so on. And then you don't start from scratch, you start from those document package where you just put a lot of stuff on top of it. So if you don't have any experience, that might be a good idea. When you have a lot of experience, then I look at these, and some of those I just want to throw out because I already have the preference of working in a certain way. And I say, like for the risk management registers, for example, I say, okay, I can't work with these because they don't really work for me. So I want to work in a different way. So I'm just throwing it all out and making my own from the scratch. But if you're just starting out, it's all right to use some other, already predefined things and just build on top of that or change wherever you need to change. And also there are a lot of standards and guidance. Like if you look at the NIST cybersecurity framework, if you look at the CIS, so that Center for Internet Security controls, they have a little bit also guidance on the different types of policies with where you could also use these as a statements for your own policies. So there are many resources to use. I think now the issue is that there is too much information rather than that there is too little. So now we get overwhelmed by the amount of information. All right, so let's look at the certification process. now we'll go really quickly through this one because it can be very complicated, but we'll make it simple. So the certification process, the start to understand that a little bit, we need to look at the different bodies. I always laugh that bodies everywhere with this one. So ISO as an organization does not provide certification, and the certifications are provided by independent parties, which are called certification bodies. And generally, there is no requirement for that certification body to be accredited, but in most of the cases and some of the governmental organizations have a requirement to only get the certification from accredited certification body. So the accreditations are then issued by accreditation body. And accreditation, this is a process that gives sort of accreditations to those certification bodies. So basically, if the organization A is an accreditation body and organization C is going to be a certification body, so that certification body satisfies a lot of requirements which are stated in another standard, ISO 27006, I think was it. And then if it satisfies all of those requirements, which also includes, for example, requirements that they need to have a certain amount of lead auditors who have passed certifications themselves and so on, then that accreditation body A grants that certification body C permission to provide certifications to other companies. So hopefully I managed to explain this one simply, but it is simple, but it sounds very complicated, but though it is simple. So when that accreditation body tells you that certification body, you're now all good, you can go and do the certification assessments, do the certification audit and give out certifications to the companies. That's where usually the companies go to. So they find the certification body, and then that certification body can grant them the certificate for the ISO 27001. And the certification works in 3-year cycles. So before you get the certificate, you can also have pre-certification or readiness assessment done either by that certification body that is going to do the actual audit, or you can look at the other third parties, or you can do it yourself. And then when you do that, when you already feel that you're ready, then you go through the certification audit. And if you pass the certification audit, you get a certificate. And now that you get a certificate, it's not over. Then the next year or it can be also more frequent, but usually it's once a year. So the next year, you have to go through the surveillance audit, and then you have to pass the surveillance audit. And then the next year, you have to go through the surveillance audit again, and you have to pass it again. And once that is over, then you have to recertify. So every 3 years, you have to recertify, and that's go on for as long as you're maintaining certification. So if you don't recertify, you lose your certification. That's pretty much it. So how does the organization obtain a certification? If we just do it by step, so you do the easy part, not really the easy, but you do the easy part, implementing all ISMS. Then you have the internal audit, you have your management review, then you select your certification body, then you prepare for the certification audit, and then there is a stage 1 audit, then there is a stage 2 audit, and then there is an audit follow-up. And then you passed everything, you confirm the registration, and then you obtain your ISO certification. Easy. And there is a requirement. Your ISMS must be operational for at least 3 months, and at least an internal audit and management review must be conducted before you're able to go to the certification audit. So therefore, the step 2 has conduct an internal audit and a management review. If you don't have these in place, you can't really go to the certification audit. So if we look at that audit process or steps, so there is the preparation, where the auditors, for example, ask you to send the loads of documentation, agree on the opening meeting, agree who will be interviewed, and a bunch of other details. And the purpose of the stage 1 audit is basically to review the policies, procedures of ISMS. So this is a documentation review. And in that review, we're looking for different elements. So do you satisfy all the clauses, clause 4 to 10 in the ISO certificate? And if there are any findings, then you need to prepare the remediation plan, basically, or a mitigation action plan. And the auditor writes up together with you a corrective action report. And that documents the root causes of the findings, that documents what were the findings, what were the evidences for the findings, and also your planned actions on how you're going to fix the findings. And then if you manage to pass stage 1 audit and remediate successfully if there were any findings in that stage 1 audit, then you get to the stage 2. And stage 2 is basically verification that what you have written in the policies and procedures is actually implemented. So that includes also interviews with people or checking some of the controls, can be looking at some system settings, can be a bunch of things. And again, if there are any findings on the stage 2 audit, there's again a corrective action report, and there's again remediation of findings. And if you manage to fix all that, or action plans are agreed or accepted, that depends if the findings were serious or not. Those action plans need to be approved by management if they contain non-conformities. And then once you pass all of that, you get the auditor submits the recommendation for the certification, and then the certification body decides based on that recommendation whether or not to grant you the certificate. And if they decide to grant you, then woohoo, you got the certificate, all good. And then you start on that 3-year cycle, that maintenance, and yeah, there's a lot of work in between that as well. So getting the certificate is not the most difficult part. It's still a lot of work after getting the certificate as well. And in that certification audit, where I mentioned those corrective action reports, so normally these are issued when you have non-conformities, and non-conformities are failures to meet the requirements. So if you don't have information security policy documented, approved by management, communicated, and so on, all those requirements that I stated before, you will get a major non-conformity. There can also be minor non-conformities. So for example, if you have the information security policy, which is documented, which is approved by the management, it is communicated, but maybe not in the most proper way communicated to all employees, then you might get a minor non-conformity. Or if it's communicated, but maybe there are some, I don't know, maybe your version history is not updated properly, then you can have an opportunity for improvement. So there are different types of non-conformities that can be. And if you have a number of major non-conformities, you will not be getting a certificate until they are fixed, and you won't even proceed to the stage 2 audit until they are fixed. And all the major non-conformities need to be fixed within the given deadline, which is usually fairly short. It can be up to 2 months, but usually even shorter than that. Before that goes also for the when you already have the certificate. If you have major non-conformities in the surveillance audit, you will need to fix them very quickly. Otherwise, you lose the certification. And then the scope and the time frame of the audit is based on the number of employees and also the level of the risk associated with your management system. So as I said, if the auditor perceives your management system as or some issues or some context of the organization that puts in a certain risk category, they might decide that they need to do the surveillance audits not once a year, but twice a year, 3 times a year, or so on. And then also there is a number of days. So for example, for certain number of employees, you have a number of days how much the auditor needs to spend time in the organization doing the audit. So the auditor can spend 3 days, for example, if you less than 200 something people, or he can spend 5 days if you're over that threshold, for example. And so that is decided by the number of employees, but also by the risk level. Yes. Questions?
Yes. From what I hear, there are a lot of effort by getting and keeping that certificate. What's the benefit of it? Because you can implement policy and, you know, live without certificate.
Yeah, you can implement the policies and live without the certifications. That's all good. Most of the times why organizations decide to move towards the certification process is because it's much easier to provide the certificate during the request from the clients, vendors, third-party suppliers, I don't know, partners, other auditors, controlling institutions, like, you know, for the financial organizations or some governmental organizations as well, than having to come them and do the audits each single time. So imagine if you want to have 5 partners and they all ask to look at your information security and conduct the audits themselves. That's going to take a lot of effort. So getting a certification and just providing them certificates saying like, well, the third party independent body has verified our information security management system. We are now certified. So, you know, we have these policies and things in place. And instead of you coming and checking everything in our organization, you are getting the certification and you're just showing the certification. So that's one of the benefits. Other benefits, there are more. If you look at the ISO standard, they have a lot of benefits listed because, well, they're earning money for people buying the standards and, you know, having this model. But just for normal organizations, it's really how much effort it is to prove everyone that you have a proper system in place versus how much effort it is to maintain the certification. And usually to maintain a certification is less effort than it is to prove everyone. And then the other bit, some of the organizations have this as a requirement, whether from the as a regulatory requirement. They don't necessarily have it to be certified. They sometimes have it like to follow the good practice standards when implementing and managing and governing your information security. But again, getting certified and implementing it based on the ISO standards is just more easier and convenient than dealing with audits and trying to prove that you really have this in place without the certification. So that's the short answer, but for the benefits, there's definitely more listed in the ISO pages, and companies who provide the certification, they can list you a number of benefits why you should be getting certified. But that's my honest opinion, that these are basically how you deal with the hassle of having everyone coming to look at you.
But there are some, if there are cases when it's mandatory to have ISO certificate.
I've only seen a few of those. So there was, but again, it was more coming not as mandatory through regulation, but more as a mandatory through governing organization, which told each of their companies under it that they should be getting the certificate because that's the way they want to organize themselves. But most of the regulations where I've seen, they don't require the certification. They require you to follow the good practice standard. So they don't specifically say to be certified.
Okay, got it.
So probably there is no fast way to get certificate or easy way.
It depends if you want a living ISMS or paper ISMS. It's possible to be compliant and get certified not too complicatedly, let's say. But then, you know, you can only run ISMS for 3 months and then apply for the audit and certification and get certified. But then the maintenance is going to be hell if your policies don't live up to reality, because every time you'll be having an audit and the auditor wants to talk to the employees in the organization, will those employees be able to explain what kind of policies and processes are in place? They aren't actually implemented in place. So if you want a living ISMS, it's more complicated. You have to have everyone on board and knowing what they're doing. If you only want to be compliant, it's possible to get through the certification in some cases, but it's going to be a lot of troubles when maintaining it if you're getting in it that way.
Okay. So is it possible to find a funny part for going through that certification process?
Is it possible to
find a funny part? What you can like about you during this certification process?
I did not understand the question, sorry.
So,
can you rephrase it?
Yeah, I'm trying to. So, is it possible to find a funny part for I don't know, for company to go during all this certification process, or is it just a big pain?
I mean, the certification process is obviously just one part of ISMS implementation process. So the most difficult part really is implementing ISMS. It takes a lot of effort to implement it properly with all of that. If you implement it properly, all of that, then the certification is much easier and actually fairly straightforward if everything is working as expected in your implemented ISMS. I, for one, have a lot of fun either doing the audits or going through audits. I find them fascinating. So for me, it's fun in either way. But for your employees, you can make it fun to have ISMS in place through other ways. So for example, when you're implementing the awareness program, you can have fun trainings. You can have more gamification. You can have people collecting points when they, pass the training on the policies, or you can give them kudos or something like that when they send the information properly and explain to the colleagues. There are a number of things that you can do to make this process not as boring, but more fun. It's the standard. The reading of the standard can be pretty boring for many people, I've been told. I found it quite fun myself, so I can't speak for all of the people, just myself. But yeah, you can make it not as painful for employees. If you adjust your policies that they both passing the requirements, but actually written in that way that reflects the reality. And then the audit process is not as complicated either. So the balance, the answer is the balance.
Okay.
So to implement that information management system in small companies, much more easier than in big company, yes?
Yes, and when the auditors look at this risk associated with your management system and this ISMS in general, they also take the context of the organization into account. So your context of the organization will define that saying, okay, it's fine for you to have only one policy and have the rest as a workflows when you like 5 employees. But it might not necessarily be sufficient when you're like 5,000 employees, because all right, is everyone able to follow it or not? Is everyone aware? The bigger the organization is, the more there is expectations of structures and policies in place. So for the smaller organization, what passes for the smaller organization, when you start growing more up, you will need to add more structure and more policies to maintain the certification and continue being certified just in general.
So it means if a company grows, so this information management system also should evolve. And
yes, so if we go to the very beginning, which is here. So this plan, do, check, act, and especially this improvement part is supposed to be like a cycle. So during this improvement part, you always checking whether your ISMS is working as expected, and you need to have this continuous improvement mindset. So you're always checking your policies, you always checking your processes, and you say, okay, do I need to add more policies here? Do I need to change my policies? Do I need to add more controls? Are my controls working effectively? If not, why they are not working effectively? Do I need to change something here or there? Also, your risk management and your risk assessment will also do input here. So there is a continuous improvement on your ISMS, and when auditors come, they expect to see that you have been improving over time. So if there were issues before, that you remediated those issues. If some processes were not very mature, that you increased the maturity of those processes. So you have to constantly be improving your ISMS. That's the expectation.
Yes, as usual, nothing is more permanent as changes.
Yes, that's totally true. Yes, Women4Cyber, join us. I guess that's the closing remark. Or anyone else wants to add anything? 1 minute left? No. All right, so if you have any more questions or anything, ping me. I'll probably send some sort of a questionnaire after the lecture, because I want to hear how I can make this better, more interesting and fun for the people. So please do let me know. And I stopped sharing so I can take a look at least one face if I can see it. And if there are no more questions, I'm gonna say good.